Good morning, bonjour. Welcome to the second day of the workshops organized by the Union of the Mediterranean and the Open University of Catalonia, the UOC. My name is Pastora Martínez and I'm Commissioner for International Action at the UOC. In this first session in the morning today, together with my colleague Deborah Arnold, we are going to explore how to include in a university all those learning models, the frameworks, competencies that my colleagues provide you yesterday. But then this is just the first session. Then we will have a 30-minute break. A second session will come on quality and in higher education by Nati Cabrera and Maite Fernandez. And then we will have the final remarks of these 4 sessions by Lourdes Guardia and Marcelo Maina. Before starting the content of this first session today, let me remember that at the end of our presentations, there will be a space for questions and answers. So please don't hesitate, don't be shy, raise your questions in the chat, and we will try to answer them all at the end of this session. And also as a reminder, the webinars will be shared with all the registered participants, and also maybe the most interesting part is that we are producing a guidebook summarizing all the sessions and also including all the concepts, the references, the takeaways, and some recommendations for you all. So you will be provided with this guidebook as well. And now we enter in the presentation and the session this morning. Let me explain you briefly the outline of the session today. So yesterday in the 2 sessions you follow, we went through the perspective of the teacher and the learner. And both sessions explained very well the different models of education mediated through technology and also useful frameworks and for e-learning and even new technologies like AI embedded and integrated in education. And how can we use these technologies to support and reinforce both learners, teachers, but also the learning pathways. Today, in this first session in the morning, we are gonna focus our discussion in the institution's perspective, stressing out the importance of the strategy and also the leadership within an organization that wants to include those technologies into their educational models and also in a systematic way in their daily life. Because something that is really important is that digital education of higher education is not just about learner and teachers, it is for sure about them, but also about the whole university and concerns all the staffs, also higher level leadership, but also administration staff. So when addressing the digital transformation of a higher education institution, strategic leadership, institutional change management, and the implementation of processes are key elements. And that's why in this session, we will go through the strategic relevance of digital transformation in the future competitiveness of higher education. We will also go briefly into the current trends of digital education, digital transformation, in higher education. Also, we will go deeper into the role of senior leadership as a critical element for a successful transition. And finally, we will explore some barriers and enablers in digital transformation and identify them for you. So let's go to the strategic relevance of the digital transformation and higher education. And let me start with this report by the UNESCO published last year that although it is focused on primary and secondary education, we brought it here to point out what technology means when talking about education. Technology is an input. We should ensure the provision, the operation, the maintenance of technology infrastructure in education, computers, internet connectivity, even electricity sometimes. So this is very important to have it in mind. Also, technology means a means of delivery and a skill, as already was explained yesterday by my colleagues, and will be also addressed later on. But it is also a planning control tool to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of management. For instance, collecting information on student behavior and also outcomes. And also it provides a social and cultural context because technology affects all spheres of our life, expanding opportunities for connection and also for access to information, but also providing some risks to safety or privacy, sometimes equality, that should be taken into account when going through this digital transformation. And having these in mind, and to understand the strategic relevance of digital transformation in higher education, we also need to look at the wider context in which the university operates. And here is a nice scheme adapted from Olcott and colleagues published last year that frame this context, this wider context, in terms of global megatrends, also the evolution of the specific higher education institution and landscape characteristics, and also how the fourth industrial revolution is affecting everything. So with the global megatrends here are included, but not limited to war, recession, emergency, crisis, or climate change, migration, also pandemics, and even these cuts in the public funding. And for this, the higher education also needs to introduce pedagogies where addressing questions to access, equality, equity, and inclusion. And in that sense, in countries where the traditional degrees, bachelor degrees, are 3, 5, 4 years long, also a significant investment beyond the budget of many students are provided. So the attractivity, for instance, of short courses, micro-credentials, for instance, are also to be considered in all this strategy. And here it's important also to take into account. And this is connected with the right side of the slide with this fourth industrial revolution and the developments associated to it, where major technological changes also requires a constant reskilling, upskilling, and also reinforcing this idea of lifelong learning. So here, the middle, we as universities, we face some opportunities, major opportunities also to reach out new categories of learners, also to position ourselves strategically, but also we have some needs there, and we should think about the professional development of both academic and professional staff, because this is key, and also the development of the leadership capacity through the institution. And this needs to brings our higher education institutions to embrace the potential of digital technologies, but also being pretty much aware of the risk that are involved. So if we go first to the student's perspective, we know that digital education can contribute to improve the student engagement because it can offer an increased flexibility, especially to those that were not those traditional students, university students. This vision of the traditional student being in the early 20s, attending on campus full-time, is becoming more and more diffuse when diversifying the students' population. So here, there's at least the potential to broaden the student body and to include some other non-traditional students at the university, including people that are working while students, so part-time students in that sense, or people living abroad and student at our university, for sure lifelong learners that are also more adults. Let's say that these young learners we have in traditional universities, people with disabilities, also people living in rural areas or cities without a university there, and people that want to include all the perspectives, no, in the education. But in addition to this, we as universities and higher education institutions have the responsibility to also to prepare students in this digital society, digital economy. And this is important to provide them the digital skills, but not just digital skills or specialist profession as computer programming or even artificial intelligence we were talking about yesterday, but also include the digital, the information, the media, even the AI literacy, because it's very important for them to be aware of all the implications that this increasing technology-driven society has for us. This is for the student's perspective, but then if we go to the institution perspective, this digital education transformation can brought us to a strategic positioning, and it's very important not to rush into the digital transition of our universities. We have without having a clear idea of the purpose, the identity of the university we want to have, even the values, and without knowing enough about what digital technologies, potential risk and also opportunities they brought us. So integrating this digital transformation into the strategy of the university and the strategic plans can bring us operational efficiencies to open up new opportunities, but also we should be pretty much aware also of the risk of these digital technologies. And let me share here these guidelines published by the European Commission on the ethical guidelines of, for instance, artificial intelligence when in education. No? So there are many more studies provided referring to these potentials of digital education, but also the risk of the technologies to be pretty much aware. And an important last point in this aspect that should be, and we will, I think we will come out later on with this, is this idea of a whole institutional approach in order to make a successful digital transition in our institutions. This idea of the whole institution making the transformation in order to be more digital and not just a few teachers there. So in this context, having the broad picture of where we are at and what's going on, we wanted also to share with you the current trends of digital transformation. And let me start and share with you this survey that the International Association of Universities, the EAU, produced and collected before the corona pandemic. It's a very interesting study that you have here, the reference, because it was conducting, as I said, in the last, previous to the corona, so by the end of 2018 and at the beginning of 2019 and published then. but it collected more than 1,000 answers from institutions from more than 120 countries around the world. So it's a global study. They're very interesting to compare with. If we go into the national context first, before entering into the institutional perspective, what it could be shown at that time is that digital transformation of higher education was already in many national regulatory policies and also in some financial frameworks of these national higher education systems. As you can see here in the draft, all the answers are distributed in the five continents, and here, well, 5 regions or continents. But here you can say that there were many countries already worried about this digital transformation in higher education, both at a regulatory perspective and putting some budget here. And in fact, when going to this support that the national policies were given to the system, what you can see that there was, yes, some support from these national regulatory bodies and regulatory funders that were providing to the universities in order to push for a digital transition at the universities. But also when describing what was the national internet infrastructure there, you can see here the differences between the regions. And some of them said, like in Europe, for instance, that the internet infrastructure was pretty much very satisfactory or good enough. But then when you compare it to Africa, it was the most answered question was that it was good enough in big cities, but poor in rural areas. So there's a inhomogeneous disparity of this infrastructure key and essential in order to make this digital transition at the higher education work. But when asking them about this importance given to digital transformation, again, at the national level, you can see that everywhere in the globe, there was a high priority, even previous to the corona crisis, to digital transformation in higher education systems. And now I take into account all this context, the national context, and asking the institutions what was going on at the institutional level. Again, there was a very well, the most common answers displayed here was that there was an institutional strategy with a clear vision in some of the institutions. Depending on the regions, for instance, it was mostly 50% of those institutions said that there were a clear vision in the digital transformation previous to the corona in Europe. But when looking into Africa, for instance, this answer of the clear vision of what digital transformation means at the institutional level, it was around 34%. Yeah, so big numbers concerning the context we have previous to the pandemic. Maybe the most interesting is what that faculties and departments were answering, that they were thinking about this digital transition probably more than the institutional level, and this is something to discuss. But everywhere, what we can see is that the institutions were already thinking about introducing digital transformation at the universities. But the approach was different in the different institutions also across the globe. For one of those were taking the technology as to do the same thing they were doing. These were the last answers, but most of them were thinking of introducing technology in order to do different things and to plan to do differently. But there were some problems with the funding, and here you can see again the big numbers in this third answer of the planning was there, but not the fundings in Africa, for instance, compared to the planning and this high response of 63% in Latin America and the Caribbean. And when talking about the infrastructure at the institutional level, the high level of priority of the digital infrastructure was already there in all the institutions that answered this survey globally, in very similar in the regions. There are no disparities here. But the budget that was allocated to this digital transition was depending on the institutions around less than 10% or between 10 and 90% in the several institutions. So that was for the previous to the corona outbreak. Then the corona came, and most of the universities, also the schools, were locked down and changed to this emergency remote teaching, most of them in those months of crisis. So there's this interesting survey that the Association of Commonwealth Universities, so the universities related to the Commonwealth, so the English-speaking universities, let's say, produced in 2020, just during the COVID. And with this survey, they produced these recommendations for universities that were listed here. So in order to produce to generate a successful digital transition, we as universities should provide the financial and technical support to improve access to data, access to devices, access to the internet connections, also to develop targeted policies to address the digital divide within universities, the importance of mainstreaming the digital transformation, as we were mentioning before, and also to recognize the ability to move research activities online that varies considerably according to the discipline, and putting research in particular areas at risk. And these recommendations were produced because although most of the institutions and the countries said that the digital transformation was already a priority during the COVID crisis, what we saw during the pandemic was that probably we were not that prepared that we were saying in the surveys before. Unfortunately, we don't have global surveys for the moment of what's going on today, although the EIU, the International Association of Universities, launched a global survey similar to the one I showed you previously these previous months. So they will publish the results hopefully at the beginning of next year. But here you will have, and again, I'm referring to this report from the UNESCO, again, referring to primary and secondary school, but maybe we can take some takeaways here from the results that they were collecting last year is that this idea that the fast pace of changing the technology is putting some strain on education systems to adapt. And that's why, again, strategy, institutional strategy and leadership is key. And this is why now I will give the floor to my colleague, Deborah Arnold, in order to go through this strategic role of the senior leadership in this digital transition. But first, to giving you the floor, Deborah, let me introduce you to our viewers and public today. So Deborah has over 3 decades of experience in the field of education and training in Europe, in teaching, in management, and in governance roles. In fact, she obtained her PhD from the work some years ago, and her research focused on digital education leadership in higher education. Deborah is currently sector consulting manager at NTT Data, collaborating a lot with the European Commission, former vice president of EDEN, and member of several editorial board. So she's really an expert in this digital education leadership in higher education. And I will give the floor to her to continue this session. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Pastora, and thank you as well for setting the scene with the context, and then now we can look into the more specific question of the role of senior leadership. I'm just making sure that I'm in control of everything. Okay, so talking about the role of senior leadership, one of the most important things is to think about what we mean when we say leadership. There's very often a focus on the individual, often linked to the formal role of this person, so the hierarchy within a university, and so that's when we talk about the individual leader. But in the research, we can also see that when we talk about leadership, that it's more than just the work of a single person, and that leadership has this collective understanding, so a collective focus, and also a focus on the processes at work within any institution. And one of the most common definitions of leadership is that it's a social influence process to guide a group of people towards achieving a common goal. So these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at the role of senior leadership, and constantly asking ourselves, what is our perception of leadership as leaders ourselves, but how is leadership perceived as well within the institution? And this links back to what Pastora said earlier about the culture, the values, and the identity of a particular university. Some leadership models will work better in different contexts, and so it's partly the role of the senior leadership to tap into that, to know the culture of the institution very well, but also to think about what might need to be changed to support digital transformation. And we're going to look into that in more detail later. Also, this question of having a common goal. How do we ensure that the goal is shared and understood by everybody who needs to work towards reaching it? So just a couple of things to keep in mind here. So when we're talking about, first of all, vision making and strategy, so what I'm going to do is talk you through the role of senior leadership through different angles. The first one here is vision making and strategy. And this is a reference to the Alcott et al. Publication that Pastora mentioned earlier, Leadership 2030, Renewed Visions and Empowered Choices for European University Leaders. This publication, although it particularly targets the European context, because it looks at those global mega trends, the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, it will be relevant whichever region of the world you're in. So this is looking deeply, as I said just now, into our identity as a university. Are we an open university like WOC with a very, very diverse global population of students? Are we a traditional research-intensive university where we have to maintain our rankings internationally, but we still have to focus on teaching and learning, of course, and supporting that? Are we a widening participation university, supporting a local community? Again, that's really a starting point for any vision making and strategic thinking that goes on within universities. And linked to that, what is our role and purpose in the digital age? Again, Pastora mentioned earlier the different ways in which we need to support students developing those high-level digital skills so that our graduates can contribute to the digital economy, but also ensuring those questions of access and equity. Again, each university is going to have its own particular vision linked to its identity, linked to its values, and then connected to all that, really defining a vision for digital education linked to the strategy for the institution. There are several examples of very, very close alignment that we can find. I have an example of a university which did define itself as a widening participation institution, and who actually had the unique opportunity to build a new campus, and they built it based on a pedagogical model. So you had everything that was in place to support their vision for increasing access, increasing participation, all aligned with their strategy, overall institutional strategy, and the specific plans for digital education. And again, as Pastora highlighted, we cannot ignore the internal and external factors, what we call drivers or enablers and barriers, and we'll come back to those at the end of this session. Okay, in Pastora's presentation, there was also a talk, a reference to the funding at national level, but also at institutional level. So when we talk about resources and sustainability, and for me and from the research that I've done, these two really, really go together. Sustainability is often framed in terms of the triple bottom line of sustainability, where you need to think about the financial aspects or the financial impact of any technology choices you make, the impact on the planet, and this is becoming more and more important, especially as we see the impact of these new technologies or fast-growing technologies such as artificial intelligence, and the massive amounts of energy and water that are needed to maintain the data centers and the computer clusters that run these systems. So the financial sustainability, the environmental sustainability, and the impact on human beings. So this is where issues of ethics and equity again come in very, very strong when we're talking about sustainability. Might not be very clear, but we will have the references for you. This is a very, very nice paper by a colleague, Neil Selwyn, EdTech Within Limits, anticipating educational technology in times of environmental crisis. And what we're seeing now as well is that more and more, but still not enough, there are moves to integrate the environmental impact of technology, the carbon footprint of our digital education initiatives into reporting. We're starting to see business models that take into account this factor as well, and also requirements from national accreditation and quality assurance agencies who are requiring reporting on this factor. And of course, again, not forgetting those very, very important ethical issues of, for example, if we decide to integrate online proctoring, online proctored exams into our digital education offer, how does that impact certain learners who might have difficulty using the systems, who might be flagged falsely for cheating, and so on, which again circles us back to the very way we see digital education, and maybe the ethical impact, the human impact of such choices might cause us to then rethink the way we do teaching and learning and the very way we do assessment. That's from the really looking into back into the pedagogy. And then other issues that are related to resources and sustainability are the infrastructure. Again, do we have the sufficient infrastructure within our institution, within our country, within our region? Is the infrastructure up to scratch in terms of what we want to do, or do we need to be perhaps more modest in the short term, but also look ahead to later developments that will enable us to really achieve those goals? And again, at an institutional level, in terms of scalability, there are several examples of where very, very nice initiatives have been taken at faculty level, at department level, but for technical reasons, for financial reasons, for human resources reasons, they cannot be scaled out across the institution. Maybe there's a case for keeping them as isolated initiatives. Maybe there's a strategic case for supporting what can be called seed initiatives, pilot projects, and then do a full review to test whether they can actually be scaled up across the institution. That's obviously looking towards mainstreaming certain activities. Also, we need to think about how agile we are as an organization. As we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's very difficult to switch from one day to the next to a completely different way of doing things. And I think if we looked at what happened, although from some of the specialists in online education, there was some criticism of, or quite a lot of criticism, in fact, of the pedagogical models that were put in place that were called emergency remote teaching. In fact, when you look at how many institutions got online, were able to continue their activity through this emergency remote teaching, we can see that there was a certain amount of agility there. But then again, if you look at universities who already had a clear vision for digital education, who already had the appropriate pedagogical models in place and the technology, these institutions were able to continue with much more active learning online because they'd already thought about how that could be integrated into their teaching and learning practices. So this is something to keep in mind, organizational agility, how quickly can we respond to exchanges to changes in the external environment, and how we organized around that. Okay, so coming back to the human aspects of digital transformation, and again the role of senior leadership, questions that need to be asked. And this is a very, very lovely publication, international publication from colleagues. It's an open access book as well. So Laura Chanovich and Catherine Cronin, Higher Education for Good. And when we're looking at the ethical aspects of digital transformation within the higher education context, I think this is a must read for anybody who is in a senior leadership position looking to take higher education forward in the coming years. So within the institution, as I said earlier, thinking very, very deeply about how leadership is perceived within the institution. What is our culture? What is the leadership culture? Is it top down? Is it very distributed? Is it very collegial, collaborative? And how does that fit what we want to do? Knowing enough about the different models of leadership. So this question of top-down leadership, which for many contemporary researchers is more aligned with our vision of management than it is leadership. We hear a lot about distributed leadership in the higher education space, which many people find very, very attractive. Because of this collegial nature of our institutions. But when you look deeper at how distributed leadership actually works, it's often very, very, let's say, effective on a project basis, where you give responsibility, you delegate to particular projects. But when that project finishes, everybody goes back to the original way of working. So there's more and more consensus now that if you want distributed leadership to work, then it has to be understood by senior leadership, and it has to be supported by senior leadership. So the people in these more distributed roles need to be, their leadership needs to be fully recognized. Something that comes up very frequently here is the role of learning and teaching centers. And again, Laura Chanovich, co-editor of Higher Education for Good, has a very lovely paper out as well about the changing role of centers for teaching and learning. And so thinking about the position of these within the institution and the recognition of the professionals who work there. And so this is linked to the point about talent alignment. Have we got the right people in the right place? And how much freedom do we have as an institution to recruit the right people to the right roles? In some very, very centralized countries, such as France, where I live and work, there's growing freedom for universities to recruit the talent that they need, but especially on what we call the professional side of house, so the staff working in those learning and teaching centres, or as learning designers, educational developers, learning technologists. Their career paths are defined on a very strict national scale. And we also know that the salaries in higher education are not necessarily as attractive as in the private sector. So there are many, many challenges within higher education in terms of attracting talent. But what do we then do? What incentives do we give the people that we have to change? And how can we support their own development? And then another human factor really at the center of digital transformation is this question of trust. And when we're looking at it from a senior leadership perspective, we need to think about trust in the leadership. We need to think about fostering trust within the institution among staff and between staff and students. And then the third angle of trust is the trust in the technology. How far do we trust the use of artificial intelligence? How do we trust the surveillance aspect of proctoring and other forms of technology use? So this question of trust is really central when we're looking at the human factors from a senior leadership perspective. Just earlier, we mentioned organizational agility. Here we look into the question of organizational dynamics, so the dynamics within the institution. And again, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the role of those different professional staff members, including here as well the IT staff who are indispensable for keeping the systems running, the learning technology staff, the educational development, the faculties and the governance. How do we get, as senior leaders, how do we get these different categories of staff and different units working across the traditional boundaries? Breaking down silos is something that is very frequently mentioned as a need for successful digital transformation. And then coming back to fostering shared understanding. And it's really only by bringing these different people together, working across the boundaries, that we can reach a shared understanding and then reach the shared vision that, again, is the responsibility of the senior leadership, taking this group of people on the journey towards a common goal. And people will necessarily have different perspectives, different priorities, but it's important to get as close as possible to this shared understanding and shared vision. And one way to do this is also to look very, very closely at the question of leadership development. And again, in the research, we look at this from the two perspectives, from the individual perspective and from the organizational perspective. So leadership development, again, is understood as individual leader development. What do I do as a leader to develop my own leadership capacities, competences, skills? What kind of training do I follow? Do I engage in coaching? Do I get feedback from peers, feedback from people that I work with within the institution? So that's on the individual level. But on the collective level, again, from the senior leadership perspective, what do we do to facilitate leadership development of others? How do we support the next generation of leaders within our institution? So this is what opportunities do we give our learning technology staff, our educational developers? What about leadership development within faculties? There's another branch of leadership research which is all about academic leadership, and what some of us are trying to do is to bring together digital education leadership and academic leadership, so that because we're talking about digital education, so that the whole questions of learning and teaching with technology are framed within this whole idea of leadership. And then the third angle in terms of leadership development is understanding it as increasing the leadership capacity of the institution. So focusing on people, but also focusing on the way the structures are organized. Also thinking about the role of students in this process. How much do we bring students into the decision-making process? Is it relevant for us? And then circling back again to our identity and our vision as a university. So looking at leadership development and what we can do in concrete terms, and this is one of the reasons why I'm actually in Barcelona speaking to you today, is that as of tomorrow at WOC I will be running this Digital Education Leadership Academy. So this is just to give you a picture of how such leadership development could take place. You can think about how relevant it would be for your own institutions. So this is part of a wider initiative where we do a 3-day in-person workshop here in Barcelona. There's a system of online preparation and follow-up. We work in small groups with 20 to 25 participants to get really the most valuable exchanges. We bring in case examples from experienced institutions and leaders so that the participants hear from real world cases. We work on action plans so that the participants can take things home with them. This is going to be the 2nd edition. This year we ran it for the first time last year. And if you're interested, then obviously you can stay tuned for the next editions and see what potential there is for you. Okay, so I think now we move on to some of the barriers and enablers, which we're going to look at in more detail before we go into the question and answer session. So what we have here is a selection of barriers which may be familiar to those of you joining from African universities. Adoption rates of technology, challenges related to implementation, challenges related to the lack of technological infrastructure that we've referred to before. However, on the enablers side, there are very, very interesting cases of pedagogical innovations. We can also really mobilize all the initiatives around faculty development, bringing the students in, as I mentioned earlier, and framing all of this in terms of institutional strategies. And again, in the research, there's now a real argument for taking us away from what we call the deficit approaches of problem solving, overcoming the barriers, but looking to the enablers and looking at how we can mobilize these to help us drive digital transformation forward. This is a very interesting report as well from the DigiAG project, which summarizes the enablers and barriers slightly differently, although we're beginning to see some trends here. Proactive participation of staff and students as among the enablers. Again, professional development and training, we can never stress that enough as being important enablers. Again, the strategic approach, and of course, not forgetting the necessary equipment in the necessary investment, in equipment and infrastructure. And again, not forgetting that important sustainability factor of scalability there. Among the barriers, this report identifies still as lack of staff resources, a lack of external funding opportunities. However, many programs there are, often on a project basis. I think we need to start looking for, again, sustainable funding to avoid the case where very interesting niche projects produce exciting and interesting results, but once the project funding has gone, then these different initiatives are not really mainstreamed back into the institutional offering and practices. Difficulties to devise a concerted institutional approach. I think if we match that back to the enabler of proactive participation of staff and students, that is one way to start overcoming that particular barrier. And then a lack of staff motivation. We know from the ground, and we know from the research that higher education staff around the world are in a state of intense fatigue, increasing demands on time, even with technology coming into that equation, making even more demands on time. There's talk that we're still in the aftermath of what was the very, very traumatic experience of the pandemic. And we can't forget, obviously, that there are other traumatic experiences linked to those global megatrends that we mentioned, whether it's war, whether it's climate disruption, as very sadly we've experienced here in Spain and in Valencia in particular in recent days. So it's understandable that academic staff and professional staff within higher education are in difficult situations. So we need to think again, as senior leaders in higher education, what we can do to support everybody we're in this complex environment of digital transformation. It's not easy, we know that, but there are enablers that we can build on. And some of the useful measures here, highlighted again by the DigiHE report, are peer exchange within the institution, so setting up the mechanisms for peer exchange, national or international training opportunities, such as those that we're offering in this online format for the Union for the Mediterranean. Collection and analysis of institutional data, and again those reports that Pastora highlighted from organizations such as the International Universities Association, the European Universities Association, are all very, very valuable bodies for doing this collection of and analysis of data, and then exchanging and collaborating amongst rectors' conferences and university networks, and really the power of networking, learning what others are doing beyond your institution, that cannot be underestimated. So in conclusion, and I'm going to invite Pastora back to help us close the session before we then address your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you all for the questions being raised. Just as a conclusion, just to remember that key factors when addressing this digital transformation are people, technology, the management, and also communication. And thank you, merci beaucoup, for following. We have many questions, Deborah, in here. So we've been trying to group them, and I will address them to both you and I, try to answer them all. We have half an hour, so I think we have plenty time enough to give an answer to them. And let me start with this idea of whole institution approach. There have been several questions here. Let me just phrase them for all of us. So one question reads that it's well known that a holistic management approach is necessary to overcome barriers like budget constraints, digital skills gap, and also resistance to change. how do you think that this should be addressed, avoiding slowing down the process of digital transformation? Do you want to start, Deborah, here, maybe?
Sorry, I was looking at the questions myself. The whole institution approach, and to avoid slowing down the digital transformation process. I think, given all the factors that we've seen, that I believe that we do need to take a step back, to take the time to think about where we're going, where we want to go, and why. So if it means taking a few months to get a good full vision of purpose, to build a strategy, then I don't think that I think that that's a valuable investment in terms of time. What we often see anyway within universities, that before the end of a particular strategic plan, which often has a duration of 4 to 5 years, already at the midpoint of that strategic plan, we're starting to think about the next plan. So it's not that there would be anything put on hold, but that second period of continuing to achieve the objectives and the goals set by the first plan, but really using that time when you're building the second generation strategy to be fully critical of what is working, what isn't working, and to use that time to get people on board. Now, what we've also seen is that fully democratic approaches don't necessarily produce the best results, because what often happens is that the final strategy is either a patchwork of individual initiatives where everybody has their say. The IT department put this in, the Centre for Teaching and Learning puts this in, the learning designers put this in. So again, this is the responsibility of the senior leadership to establish the vision and establish the mechanisms where people feel heard, where people feel that they can trust what's going on, where they have their say. But at the end of the day, that overall coherence of the strategy is the responsibility of the senior leadership. So I think the whole institution approach, yes, but guided by a vision that is the responsibility of the senior leadership, and take the time. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah. Yeah, taking time. That usually we're in a rush and we want to do everything, yeah, just overnight, but then we realize it's not possible. Here, probably also taking other learnings from other transversal issues that as university leaders want to also incorporate in our universities, and with this idea of the responsibility of senior leadership. If I can add here, maybe there's also always this strategy of combining the mainstreaming line, so the strategy across the whole institution, but then complemented with some concrete positive actions. And here I always include incentives as a recommendation in order to align all the different community boards in this alignment with the senior strategy. So the top-down and the bottom-up approach should be combined in order to make it successful. But yeah, I think is the million-dollar question probably here. There's another question related to this university leadership and the alignment, Deborah, in the chat, that were yeah. Let me read it. How can university leadership align digital education strategies with institutional goals for academic excellence, inclusivity, and social impact in the Mediterranean region, especially economically challenged country. Any idea here how to align? Not easy.
It's not easy at all. It's another $1 million question. I think underlying that question is the idea that we should align everything. I'm sorry, but that there is no, I think that the decision to align is already the first step. And then it's really making sure and circling back to everything that that you decide to do. I think having a very, very clear vision for teaching and learning is the starting point. I use the example of the University of Northampton in the UK, which I studied for my research. And so they had an overall strategic an overall strategy for the university. And then they said, we don't have a teaching and learning strategy, we have a plan, because the plan is aligned with the overarching strategy. And so I think that distinction, we don't have a digital strategy. We don't even have we have a kind of digital plan, but it's almost secondary to the teaching and learning plan, because we're looking at how the technology is supporting our teaching and learning plan and how that supports the overall strategy. So that's where the question of alignment comes in. And then, of course, at strategic level, budget is going to be allocated to each of the different strands, and there are obviously again areas that will be supported more, supported less. You know, there is no such thing as a magic money tree, as we say. And I think again that process of first of all having the vision and then building the strategy to fit, and that is the work of governance and leadership.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, and also if I can add here, in my experience, also helping some other universities in this digital transformation, it depends a lot about the context where the university is. So not just the country, maybe the region, but also the mission of this university is extremely important, as you were mentioning previously, Deborah, how important it is to have a purpose there, not just being digital for being digital, but being digital with a mean there. And I think these are the kind of important questions when, as you were saying, slow down and decide how to plan this digital transformation. There are other questions here for you, Deborah, concerning the community, university community. So one is referring to the challenges. What are the challenges of university leaders that they are facing in fostering a culture of digital transformation and innovation and adoption among the faculty, the staff, and the students? So how could we as university leaders engage all these different university stakeholders here into this transition?
Okay, thank you, Pastora. That makes me think of all the different approaches to change management. This is something that I'm looking into more and more now. I remember being at a conference at the beginning of the year, and there was a lot of talk about change management. This is what we need to do, linking it to digital transformation. And I remember standing up in the audience and asking the presenters, who were mostly chief information officers from different universities, a big role in digital transformation. And I found that they took change management almost for granted. That there was, I was looking to find out exactly what they were doing in terms of change management, which change management approaches they were mobilizing, how it was working, and beyond information and training, I was a little bit, let's say, frustrated, which is one of the reasons why this is something I'm now looking into in much more detail. And there's some interesting approaches which take us from the idea of change management, which is all about, often about overcoming resistance to change leadership, which is accompanying people again on this journey of digital transformation. And then coming back to how do we foster a culture of digital transformation? Again, it's linked to this question of building the shared understanding, building the shared vision. And again, from the examples of universities I know, and this links to what Pastora, you've just said about knowing why we are doing digital education. What is it for? There's a university which brought in a very, very innovative approach of blended learning for its on-campus students. The staff believed that the university was going to become a completely online university, like WOC. And so this was where something was missing in that change leadership process, because the teaching staff didn't have the same vision as the governors. And it took a lot of time to overcome that. So looking at different ways to embody this this change leadership aspect, and again to put behind us those deficit-based approaches of overcoming resistance to change, overcoming barriers. There are a couple of approaches that are promising. One is for anybody who might be a researcher in the social sciences listening in today, is an approach called appreciative inquiry, which is getting a group of people together to look at what is working well, and then to work to see how to reinforce that. And so that's an interesting approach that's being applied. Another one from perhaps a more centralized leadership perspective is using storytelling. Now, storytelling, I think, has to be taken with a few caveats, because we know how it can be misused in politics, for example. But if we frame it as a sense-making process, a sense-giving process, and maybe creating a narrative within the institution around digital transformation, and enabling different voices and different perspectives to be heard, then I think used widely in terms of sense making and sense giving, then storytelling perhaps has a role. There's some interesting initiatives also being done in that respect.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Deborah. So let's go deeper into the several stakeholders, because there are some questions there. And let's start with the leaders, okay? There's a question saying how to avoid the traditional institutional leadership, wherever traditional is, or another, who are the leaders in a distributed leadership? So for example, can a teacher be considered a leader? Should a senior leader in higher education have a background in research and teaching, or it could be someone specialized in leadership independently of where the experience comes from? What do you think about those leaders we need in order to make this transition work, Deborah?
Okay. These are fantastic questions, which have been asked in the research, and I think will never go away. I think it comes back to knowing about these different forms of leadership and aligning them to what we want. And also that question of time. So this is just a first angle, and then I'll come on to the specifics of the question. If you are in a position where you need to make rapid change, then probably you won't have the luxury of time to build up that distributed leadership approach. That's just one angle. Can a teacher be considered a leader? There's a lot of research that says that they can in a particular setting. I think, again, it's not saying should somebody be or not be a leader. It's where is leadership taking place? Who and how are a group of people being accompanied on a journey to a particular goal? If in a classroom setting, the goal is to help the students to reach a particular result, then that's one way that you could say that leadership was taking place. But because we're talking about digital transformation here, and leadership is taking place everywhere. There are students who are coming up with ideas on how to use technology to resolve particular issues, who are then sharing it with others. And that is a form of leadership in itself. But we know that universities still have this very, very hierarchical organization. I see very, very few examples of where that is being challenged, although there are interesting examples where, for example, a university has thought very, very deeply about their identity. They are a research-intensive university. They're a massive university. They're a historic university. They have distributed campuses everywhere. And they began by setting up this very, very distributed model where they had, for example, the learning developers, the learning technologists and the educational developers were all distributed throughout the different faculties, and they worked together at network level. They reported to brings in the hierarchy again, but they were working with a tandem of vice rectors, and I've seen this model being successful everywhere. So that question about whether you need to be a specialist in learning and teaching or a specialist in technology, some people are both, but when they're not, then these tandems of vice rectors working very, very closely together, one being more on the technology side and one being more on the learning and teaching side, those are successful models that I've seen. What was interesting about this particular university case was that the network structure was designed explicitly around a model of organizational learning. And so on the governance side, the two vice rectors really studied the question of what is a learning organization and used the research and the knowledge about that to set up the structures that they wanted. This was so successful that 4 years later, the people working in that network structure decided themselves that the best solution for the next period would be to re-centralize. But it wasn't the top governance who made that decision, it was the people on the ground, because the university had built up such maturity and trust with that network structure that the learning technologists and the manager of the Centre for Teaching and Learning were able to then recommend up to the formal governance that this is the best model for the coming period. So very nice example there.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. In fact, you already answered another question about this participatory approach of the governance, and again, still it depends a lot on the university purpose, also the context, and what's this digital transition for. So let's move to the teacher, because the teachers, because there's a very nice and interesting question that always is raised when those transitions start to be thought, or at least planned. And it's about the threat that this ICT incorporation or technology or digital incorporation to the pedagogical model, this threat to the teacher, that somehow sometimes confronts their professional identity and the traditional practices they've been using, for many, many years. So how to deal with this individual change in the pedagogical model with and for teachers. Any clue on that, Deborah?
Are you sure you don't want to answer that one, Pastora?
I can. In fact, it's a very frequent questions whenever starting a process like this. In our case at the work, so we've been born digital, so we didn't have this question to be raised, but in other institutions, yes. And here again, there are several different strategies and actions to be put in place. But I think two important strategic ways of addressing this question. One is the senior leadership. If the rector doesn't believe in this transformation, nobody's going to move. I know that now again I'm talking about this hierarchy at the university, but it is there. So the senior leadership must take a role and must give an example in this digital transformation. But then also training for teachers and raising awareness, like in the webinars we are doing right now with the Union for the Mediterranean, is key, because sometimes this resistance to change is also made of not understanding properly what's going on, and also some internal fear that are very, very common and also very logical. After being a teacher for many, many years, and now you've been told that you should change the way you are proceeding. So my two recommendations would be in that sense, to raising awareness and also providing teaching to teachers in order to be more comfortable in this new scene and landscape. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Deborah, here.
Yeah, I could, because that's making me think as well, amongst the awareness raising issues that you mentioned. I think it's important to reassure teachers and to take the long view as well. If we go back to, what was it, 2012, which was the year of the MOOC, and people were saying at the time that MOOCs would be the end of the university as we know it, that everybody would be just studying online for free, nobody would want to go to university anymore. 12 years later, MOOCs still exist. They've found their place in the landscape, but universities are still here. And we are hearing so much hype now about artificial intelligence, which in fact is much more limited than what a lot of the claims are. So I think it's sitting down, looking at the past, looking at where we are, looking at how we're using digital technology in our daily lives, and then thinking very, very deeply about what it is to be human and what the role of the teacher is. Right now, I think that we do need to be very, very alert to these evolutions in technology, but we should be careful not to be carried away either by excessive optimism or by excessive pessimism. And I think it's only by participating in the training, practicing, exchanging between peers as well, that we can find the comfortable place with respect to our practice as teachers, and then to build that into some transformation strategy of taking it forward, again taking into account the very, very important ethical and human factors.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah. So there are some other questions about teachers in the chat, but as we are running out of time, not out of time, but yeah, we are approaching the end of our session, just to remember that there will be 2 other sessions, so in fact 2 other training workshops in 2 days in December, more focusing the teacher's perspective. So I will pass the question to my colleagues when exploring that part, because I think there are other reflections in the chat that are interesting to address now. One is coming back to these current trends of digital transformation in higher education. There's a very interesting remark from Morocco saying that, in fact, the COVID-19 health crisis played a big role in this transformation. And in this is something that we've experienced in other countries that were
I think I've lost you, Pastora, for a second.
The different okay, sorry, you missed me. So maybe I will give you the floor, Deborah, because I think I have weak internet quality, and then I will come back. But this idea of, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. So I will continue. This idea of how the COVID made the push there in the digital transformation, and indeed it happened, as we can read in the chat, in Morocco, also in Spain, and I'm sure that in other countries. What I was mentioning is that previous to in my previous comments is that what we were saying as university leaders, that digital transformation was important before the corona, maybe made us think that we were more prepared than we actually were. Because when we were imposed to adapt these technological solutions during the corona crisis, many challenges appear, revealing that these education systems in the world were not that well prepared to harness the potential of existing technologies, existing platforms to assure the maximum quality in the implementation. Now, 4 years after, I think we've learned, some institutions and countries also have made this slow down movement that, Deborah, you were also mentioning. So here is an interesting question. Let me go back to that. Also, as digital transformation, as an enable for a more flexible, let's say maybe more suitable higher education. So how digital transformation is also pushing for the transition for a more flexible practices, even delivery, not just delivery format, but delivery construction, not just beyond the degree. Micro credentials are also mentioned in the chat. So let me just raise this idea of how can agility become a key driver for making education more flexible, more personalized, and even better suited in the challenges of the 21st century, and also addressing specifically micro credentials. How could that be more meaningful and appreciated by the society? Because it's still something not very well known by employers and society. So how can we address from the university, but also from the society, and take the best of this digital transition in order to make a better higher education institution to provide the learning pathways we need as students, as employers, as employees, and as citizens. How do you think, Deborah? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think I have 2 minutes to talk about this. I think it's interesting that and in the question that it's framed in terms of micro credentials, which I think is a very, very useful concrete example, because the digitalization aspect comes in at many levels. When you think of what a digital credential is, it's the digital proof of learning, and a micro credential, again, the focus is on the term credential. So it's not necessarily the course, it is again the proof of learning from a short period of learning activity. And I think the potential in terms of micro credentials is really to focus on competences rather than on a whole academic program. You can focus on a specific set of competences. In terms of getting these organized, getting these recognized by society, again, working together to co-design them, to co-design the learning, to co-design the actual certificate, digital certificate. And I see that we're running out of time, so people can contact me if they need to know any more about micro credentials, and I know there's lots of initiatives going on as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deborah. Indeed, we are running, well, just on time now. But yeah, I am sure also these other trends and perspectives and formats of higher education right now will be also addressed in the webinars to come. So yeah, and we will be here just in order to answer as much questions as we can. So thank you very much, Deborah. Thank you all for following this session. Now we are going to have a 30-minute break and come back at 11 with another section on quality in higher education. But before just finishing this part, let me just remember that all the webinars will be shared with you, but also the guidebook we are producing with all these references, all this content, and also the takeaways will be also sent to you in order to continue learning more of this exciting world in the digital transition of higher education we are all embedded in. So thank you very much. 30 minutes break and come back at 11 in Spain. You will have the times in the slide that will be posted in this short break. Thank you very much.